My name is Rachel Clark, and at 32, I thought I understood the rhythm of Granite Peak Hospital. As a charge nurse in the cardiac unit, I'd spent 6 years learning every creak of the old building's floors, every quirk of our aging equipment, and every personality that walked these halls in Rockview, Montana. The hospital sat like a fortress against the backdrop of snow-capped peaks, serving a community that depended on us for everything from routine checkups to emergency care. The first sign something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was reviewing the previous night's reports when I noticed Whitney Morgan, our registry nurse, had documented several policy violations by staff members I'd never seen break protocol. Whitney had been with us for 8 months, filling in gaps in our scheduling with the efficiency that made registry nurses invaluable. She was thorough, professional, and had quickly become someone I trusted to handle complex patient assignments. Rachel, did you see my incident report about Franklin Thompson's medication timing? Whitney approached my desk with a clipboard, her expression serious. Franklin was one of our most reliable nurses, someone who'd been here longer than I had. I scanned the report. According to Whitney's documentation, Franklin had administered medications 15 minutes outside the acceptable window on 3 separate occasions during her shifts. The timestamps seemed precise, but something nagged at me. I'd worked alongside Franklin countless times and had never witnessed such carelessness. I'll speak with him, I said, though the words felt heavy. Whitney nodded approvingly and moved on to her next task. Over the following weeks, similar reports appeared on my desk, always meticulously documented, always involving staff members who worked primarily during Whitney's shifts. The pattern was subtle enough that I initially attributed it to coincidence, but the frequency began to concern me. The hospital's electronic health record system, Epic, tracked everything we did with surgical precision. Badge swipes, medication pulls, documentation timestamps. Every action left a digital footprint. Whitney seemed to have mastered the system quickly, often pointing out discrepancies others had missed. I just want to make sure we're maintaining our standards, she'd say, when presenting another violation report. Her dedication appeared admirable, but I started noticing how certain staff members grew tense when she was assigned to their units. The breaking point came during a staff meeting in late April. Our nurse manager, Catherine Franklin, was discussing upcoming performance reviews and professional development opportunities. Several positions for advanced certifications had opened up, along with recommendations for leadership training programs. Whitney has provided excellent feedback about our team's adherence to protocols, Catherine announced. Her observations will be valuable in determining advancement opportunities. I watched as several experienced nurses exchanged glances. Franklin Thompson, who had been hoping for a charge nurse position, looked particularly deflated. Diana Whitney, another seasoned nurse, stared at her hands. After the meeting, I found myself reviewing Whitney's reports more carefully. The documentation was flawless, but the subjects of her reports shared something troubling in common. They were all nurses who had been with the hospital longer than Whitney, all candidates for the same advancement opportunities she might be interested in pursuing herself. The mountain air that usually cleared my thoughts felt thin as I walked to my car that evening. Granite Peak Hospital had always been a place where experience was valued, where mentorship flowed naturally between generations of healthcare workers. But something was shifting in that dynamic, and Whitney Morgan was at the center of it. As I drove home through the winding mountain roads, I couldn't shake the feeling that the trust I'd placed in Whitney's professional judgment might have been misplaced. The question that haunted me wasn't whether she was documenting violations. The reports were too detailed to be fabricated. The question was whether she was creating the very situations she was so diligently reporting. The next few weeks brought a cascade of incidents that transformed my growing unease into genuine alarm. Whitney's pattern became impossible to ignore once I started paying attention to the timing and targets of her reports. It began with Franklin Thompson's incident report in early May. Whitney had documented him for failure to follow proper medication reconciliation procedures during a particularly hectic shift. The violation was technically accurate. Franklin had indeed skipped a step in the electronic verification process. But what Whitney's report didn't mention was that the unit had been short-staffed that night, with 3 callouts and an unexpected influx of patients from a multi-vehicle accident on Highway 2. I knew Franklin's work ethic intimately. He'd been my mentor when I first arrived at Granite Peak, teaching me the unwritten rules that kept our mountain hospital running smoothly despite our remote location and limited resources. The idea that he would cut corners on medication safety was absurd, yet Whitney's documentation painted him as careless and potentially dangerous. She was right there when it happened, Franklin told me during a quiet moment in the break room, almost like she was waiting for me to make a mistake. He stirred his coffee absently, the exhaustion evident in his voice. 23 years I've been here, Rachel. Never had a medication error, never had a safety violation. Now suddenly I'm being written up for missing a checkbox in Epic during the worst shift we've had all month. The timing troubled me most. Franklin's charge nurse application had been submitted just 2 weeks before Whitney's report. The leadership position would have meant a significant step up in responsibility and pay, exactly the kind of advancement opportunity that Whitney herself had expressed interest in pursuing. Diana Whitney's situation followed a similar pattern. As our most experienced ICU nurse, she'd been selected for the critical care certification program that would qualify her for advanced practice roles. The program required hospital sponsorship and came with a substantial education budget. 3 days after the announcement, Whitney Morgan filed a report documenting Diana's inappropriate use of hospital resources, specifically using the staff computer to access continuing education materials during her break. The accusation was technically valid but absurdly petty. Every nurse at Granite Peak used downtime to complete required training modules. It was an accepted practice, even encouraged by administration as a way to maintain our certifications in a rural hospital where formal education opportunities were limited. I've been doing the same thing for 15 years, Diana confided to me after her meeting with Human Resources. Suddenly, it's a violation? The timing feels deliberate, Rachel. Like someone wants me out of that certification program. I started keeping my own informal documentation, noting the correlation between Whitney's reports and career advancement opportunities. The pattern was undeniable. Every nurse who had applied for promotions, certifications, or leadership roles found themselves under Whitney's scrutiny within days of their applications. Amanda Morgan, our newest hire, provided the most disturbing insight during a conversation in the medication room. Whitney's been asking me a lot of questions about the other nurses, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She wants to know about their routines, their shortcuts, anything that might not be strictly by the book. She says it's about maintaining standards, but it feels like she's building cases against people. The realization hit me like the cold mountain wind that swept down from Granite Peak each evening. Whitney wasn't just documenting violations, she was actively seeking them out, positioning herself to catch colleagues in moments of human imperfection that every healthcare worker experienced. She was weaponizing the very trust and mentorship that made our hospital community function. Her method was sophisticated and nearly undetectable. She'd volunteer for extra shifts, particularly during high-stress periods when protocols might be bent in the interest of patient care. She'd position herself strategically, always ready with her phone to document timestamp violations or procedural shortcuts. Most insidiously, she'd engage colleagues in conversations designed to elicit admissions of minor rule bending that she could later report as policy violations. The breaking point came during the 3rd week of May. Catherine Franklin called an emergency full staff meeting to address what she termed concerning trends in protocol adherence. The conference room felt tense as she outlined a series of violations that had been reported over the past month. We've had 7 separate incidents of policy violations, Catherine announced, her usually warm demeanor replaced by administrative formality. These range from medication reconciliation errors to inappropriate use of hospital resources. While we appreciate the diligence of staff members who report these issues, we need to address the underlying problems. I watched Whitney's face during the presentation. Where others showed concern or confusion, she displayed a subtle satisfaction that made my stomach turn. She was sitting in the front row, taking notes with the same meticulous attention she brought to her violation reports. Effective immediately, we'll be implementing enhanced monitoring procedures, Catherine continued. All advancement applications will be reviewed in light of recent performance documentation. We cannot recommend staff for leadership positions or certification programs if their adherence to basic protocols is questionable. The room fell silent. I could see the impact of Catherine's words on my colleagues' faces. Franklin's shoulders sagged as he realized his charge nurse application was likely dead. Diana stared at the table, probably calculating the cost of losing her certification opportunity. 3 other nurses who had applied for various advancement programs looked equally devastated. Whitney raised her hand. "I think this is a necessary step," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who believed she was protecting the hospital's integrity. "Patient safety has to be our top priority, even if it means making difficult decisions about advancement opportunities." After the meeting, I lingered in the conference room, watching as my colleagues filed out with defeated expressions. Whitney approached me, her demeanor friendly and professional. "I know this is hard," she said, "but someone has to maintain standards. These violations weren't minor oversights. They were serious breaches of protocol that could have compromised patient care." I looked at her carefully, searching for any sign of awareness about what she'd done. "The timing is interesting," I said. "All these violations happening right after people applied for advancement opportunities." Whitney's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "Good nurses don't let stress compromise their professionalism," she replied. "If they can't handle basic protocols during busy periods, how can we trust them with additional responsibilities?" That evening, I sat in my apartment overlooking the Rockview Valley, trying to process what I'd discovered. Whitney Morgan had systematically undermined every nurse who posed a threat to her own advancement. She'd used her position as a registry nurse, someone who worked across multiple units and had access to various departments, to gather intelligence and create opportunities for documentation. The most chilling aspect was her apparent belief in her own righteousness. She genuinely seemed to think she was protecting the hospital's standards, even as she destroyed the careers of dedicated colleagues who had served Granite Peak for years. I realized I had to act, but the challenge was enormous. Whitney's documentation was technically accurate, her reports professionally written, and her behavior could be interpreted as conscientious oversight rather than deliberate sabotage. Proving discriminatory intent would require more than my observations and suspicions. As I prepared for bed, I made a decision that would change everything. I would start my own documentation, but this time I'd be watching the watcher. Whitney Morgan had betrayed not just individual colleagues, but the entire culture of trust and mentorship that made Granite Peak Hospital more than just a workplace. The mountain silence outside my window felt ominous rather than peaceful. Tomorrow, I would begin the careful work of exposing a betrayal that threatened everything I valued about our professional community. The next morning, I arrived at Granite Peak Hospital with a new sense of purpose. My first stop was the administrative offices on the 3rd floor, where I requested a meeting with Franklin Davis, our chief nursing officer. His assistant scheduled me for later that afternoon, giving me time to gather my thoughts and evidence. During my lunch break, I found Catherine Morgan from Quality Assurance in the cafeteria. We'd worked together on several committees, and I trusted her judgment. I approached her table carefully, knowing this conversation could determine the success of my entire effort. "Catherine, I need to discuss something sensitive with you," I said, sitting across from her. "It's about patterns I've noticed in disciplinary actions across multiple units." She set down her sandwich, immediately attentive. "What kind of patterns?" I outlined my observations about Whitney's documentation timing, the correlation with advancement applications, and the selective enforcement I'd witnessed. Catherine listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each detail. "You're describing systematic targeting," she said finally. "That's not just unprofessional. It's potentially illegal discrimination. Do you have documentation?" "Some, but I need more." Whitney's careful to make everything look legitimate on the surface. Catherine nodded slowly. "I've been reviewing some unusual incident reports lately. Nothing that seemed connected until now, but your timeline might explain some inconsistencies I've noticed." She paused, glancing around the cafeteria. "If you're right about this, we need to be extremely careful. Whitney has allies in administration." That afternoon, I sat across from Franklin Davis in his corner office, the Montana mountains visible through the large windows behind his desk. He was a tall man in his 50s, known for his fair but thorough approach to personnel issues. "Rachel, your concerns are serious," he said after I'd presented my evidence, "but I need you to understand the position this puts the hospital in. Whitney Morgan has an exemplary record. Her documentation is thorough, her clinical skills are excellent, and she's never had a formal complaint filed against her." "That's exactly the problem," I replied. She's too smart to leave obvious evidence, but the pattern is clear when you look at the timing and targets. Franklin leaned back in his chair. I can't initiate a formal investigation based on suspicions alone. However, I can authorize a review of recent disciplinary actions to look for any irregularities in process or documentation. It wasn't the immediate action I'd hoped for, but it was a start. What about the nurses who've already been affected? Some of them are considering leaving Granite Peak. If your allegations prove accurate, we'll address those situations appropriately, he said. But Rachel, I need you to be absolutely certain about this. False accusations against a colleague can be just as damaging as the behavior you're describing. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked closely with Catherine to build a comprehensive case. We discovered that Whitney had requested schedule changes that coincidentally placed her on units during critical periods when targeted nurses were working. Her incident reports consistently focused on subjective issues like attitude or team collaboration rather than concrete policy violations. The breakthrough came when Catherine found discrepancies in Whitney's documentation timestamps. Several reports claimed to document incidents that occurred during times when security badge records showed Whitney was in different parts of the hospital entirely. This is it, Catherine said, showing me the badge access logs on her computer screen. She documented a medication error observation in the ICU at 2:47 p.m., but her badge shows she was in the pharmacy until 3:15 p.m. that day. We found 3 similar discrepancies, each involving reports that had contributed to disciplinary actions against nurses who'd applied for advancement opportunities. Armed with this concrete evidence, I returned to Franklin Davis's office. This time, he listened with the gravity the situation deserved. These badge records are concerning, he admitted, reviewing our findings. I'm going to initiate a formal investigation immediately. HR will need to interview all affected parties, and will need to suspend Whitney from registry duties pending the outcome. What about the nurses who've already been disciplined based on her reports? We'll review every case individually. If we find evidence of false documentation, those disciplinary actions will be reversed and removed from personnel files. The investigation moved quickly once it began. HR Director Amanda Thompson conducted interviews with affected nurses, many of whom had been afraid to speak up individually but found courage in numbers. The pattern of targeting became undeniable when viewed collectively. Whitney's response to the investigation was telling. Rather than expressing concern about the allegations or offering explanations for the discrepancies, she became defensive and accusatory. She claimed I was jealous of her clinical skills and suggested that the other nurses were simply trying to avoid accountability for their mistakes. During her formal interview with HR, Whitney made a critical error. When confronted with the badge access discrepancies, she claimed the hospital's security system was unreliable and that she often forgot to badge in and out of units. However, her own previous incident reports had cited other nurses for similar badge protocol violations, undermining her credibility. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Diana Foster, a nurse manager from the surgical unit, came forward with information about a conversation she'd overheard between Whitney and another registry nurse. In that conversation, Whitney had explicitly discussed keeping standards high by ensuring that certain people didn't advance beyond their capabilities. 3 weeks after I'd first approached Franklin Davis, Whitney Morgan was terminated from her position at Granite Peak Hospital. The official reason cited was falsification of documentation and violation of professional conduct standards. The real reason, systematic discrimination and abuse of authority, was documented in her personnel file to prevent her from simply moving to another facility and repeating the pattern. The aftermath was both satisfying and sobering. 5 nurses had their disciplinary records cleared, and 2 were immediately approved for the advancement positions they'd originally sought. The hospital implemented new oversight procedures for registry nurses and established a confidential reporting system for concerns about discriminatory enforcement. But the personal cost was significant. Whitney's betrayal had damaged trust throughout the hospital. Colleagues questioned whether other instances of professional accountability might have been similarly motivated. The culture of mentorship and support that had made Granite Peak special would take time to rebuild. As I walked through the hospital corridors in the weeks following Whitney's termination, I noticed subtle changes. Nurses seemed more cautious in their interactions, more aware of who might be watching and documenting their every move. The easy camaraderie that had characterized our workplace had been replaced by a more guarded professionalism. The investigation had revealed the extent of Whitney's network and influence. She'd cultivated relationships with key administrators, positioning herself as a reliable source of information about unit operations. Her betrayal wasn't just personal, it was institutional, undermining the very systems designed to ensure fair treatment and professional development. Yet there was also hope. The nurses who'd been targeted showed remarkable resilience, and their vindication sent a clear message that discriminatory behavior wouldn't be tolerated. Whitney Morgan became a champion for policy reform, working to create safeguards that would prevent similar abuses in the future. The silence in the hospital corridors felt different now, not the comfortable quiet of a well-functioning team, but the cautious stillness of a community learning to trust again. The betrayal had been exposed and justice served, but healing would take time.